Greetings from the Nerd Cave, Black Hills of South Dakota. Stan Gibilisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1GV, Whiskey 1 Golf Victor. The signals of which the signals on the receiver of which you're hearing in the background. That is a mode called WSJT. That's the name of the software that runs it. It's a slow form of frequency shift keying, multiple frequency shift keying. It's a synchronous mode, and they claim that it provides a 10 dB advantage over CW by ear. Well, if that ain't Murphy's Nemesis, I don't know what is. But I was talking in a video a little while ago about how the standing wave ratio as you measure it at your radio is not accurate because of feed line loss. I was talking about that, and I was trying to figure out, now how can I spin that into a Murphy's Nemesis? Because it sounds almost like Murphy's Victory. When you measure the standing wave ratio at your radio, you're getting an inaccurately optimistic picture of the situation. It's really worse than what you see at the radio. At the feed line, the SWR is actually a little bit worse, a little higher, I should say. It doesn't necessarily mean worse. But I'm going to explain why that is the case, and I am going to alert you to that fact. The place to measure the standing wave ratio on a transmission line that goes to an antenna is at the antenna feed point if you want an accurate picture of the match between your feed line and your antenna. And the more loss your feed line has, the longer your line or the skinnier your coaxial line is, the more the difference is going to be. And I suppose there's a way to calculate that difference, but I'm not going to get into that. The way that I'm going to spin this into a Murphy's Nemesis is like this. Murphy, I am on to ya, and I'm going to put all the other hams who watch this video onto you too, in this respect. So you can't fool us in this respect anymore. You can't get away with this anymore. Take that. Now I'll explain exactly why that happens. Just about every radio ham will recognize a diagram like this. Here's your transmitter. Here is your coaxial feed line, coaxial cable. That's what coax means. It's pronounced coax, not coax in this case. Coaxial feed line and a 50 ohm purely resistive impedance at the antenna. If you have that ideal state of affairs where your antenna has a 50 ohm impedance without any reactance in it, and you have a 50 ohm characteristic impedance for your transmission line, you will get an SWR of 1:1. In order to have a 1:1 standing wave ratio on a transmission line, two criteria must be met. First, the antenna mustn't have any reactance at the frequency of use. And second, its remaining resistance, which comprises radiation resistance, should equal the characteristic impedance of the feed line. Unless you meet both of those criteria, you cannot have a 1:1 SWR. But in that case, no matter where you measure the standing wave ratio along this line, you are going to get presumably a 1:1 reading, because the forward and reflected power, there's going to be no reflected power. So you're not going to have to worry about line attenuation screwing up your reading. But suppose that you've got some other state of affairs like I had in the contact I recently made with W1AW on 18 megahertz. I was using a 14 megahertz antenna on 18 megahertz. Well, this certainly wasn't a 50 ohm purely resistive impedance anymore. I measured an SWR of 5:1. right there at the output of the transmitter. Now, when you have a situation where you have an SWR of something other than 1 to 1, you're going to have something what they call reflected power. Now, that's a little bit of a misnomer, but what really travels along this line is not power per se, but an electromagnetic field that exists between the conductors of this line and in the dielectric material of the line. But every coaxial cable of any appreciable length, and mine is 50 feet of something called RG8X, which is maybe a quarter of an inch in diameter or thereabouts. It's not as good as the old RG8U or the RG213, and it's certainly not as good as a hard line, but it's better than RG58U coax. So I don't know exactly what the attenuation at 18 megahertz would be under perfect conditions. That's the way that they specify the decibels per 100 feet of line under perfect conditions. But I do know that the so-called forward power here, this is forward power, is going to be attenuated a little bit as it moves along this transmission line. That electromagnetic field is going to get attenuated just a little bit. So when it reaches the antenna feed point, the forward power, as it's sometimes called, I don't know if I have room to write that, do I? Abbreviated maybe. The forward power will be a little less here than it was here because of this manufacturer's line loss that exists in every transmission line. So there's going to be a slight reduction in forward power here. Then you're going to get reflected power. Now, reflected power is a strange beast. When the SWR is as bad as it was in this case, a lot of the power, as it were, the electromagnetic field, is going to return when it hits the antenna. It's sort of like light striking a window glass. Not all of it goes through the glass. Some of it gets reflected back at you or at the source of the light. Depending on the type of glass and what you've coated it with, more or less of that light may be reflected, and a similar situation exists here. In fact, with an SWR as bad as the one I probably had up here, it'd be just about like a perfect mirror. Just about all of the power is going to come back. So you're going to get a reflected power reading coming back here, but as that power, reflected power or electromagnetic field travels along this line, the same attenuation that exists in the line inevitably as a result of its manufacture will reduce the level of that reflected power slightly. So almost all of that power gets reflected back. Now, one thing that's going to do is it's going to screw up the reading of most watt meters, because most watt meters can't really differentiate between forward and reflected power, so they sort of tend to add them together. When you get the reading, they vectorially add them together, and that's whole another ballgame entirely, but it exaggerates the reading of a watt meter, so you can't believe that anymore. You've got more forward power and less reflected power here than is the state of affairs here. So you're going to see a lower SWR here than you will see here. And I would have to say that in my best estimation, this was probably around 7 to 1 at the antenna. Now, the final point I'd like to make about this reflected power is that you'd think that if almost all of the power gets reflected when it hits the antenna like that, that you're going to lose almost all of the power in your system, and almost none of it's going to get radiated. But that's not quite what happens, because your transmitter doesn't just eat that reflected power. It will send it back towards the antenna for another round. So you're going to get this multiple reflections state of affairs. So you're going to get a whole series of signals that kind of add together to produce what you finally get out of your antenna. And you can actually calculate the loss that this causes. But you need to measure the standing wave ratio at your antenna if you want to get an accurate figure as the basis for measuring that so-called SWR loss. Now, you're not going to have any SWR loss if you have a 1-to-1 standing wave ratio, but otherwise you will have some. It's usually a lot less, though, a lot less severe than a lot of people think it would be, even with an SWR as high as 7-to-1. I was able to contact W1AW on 18 megahertz with only 10 watts of output. They were in Oklahoma at the time, but only 10 watts of output on 18 megahertz. And, you know, I've worked a lot of DX, as a matter of fact, with 10 watts on 18 megahertz in that lousy match at the antenna. But, of course, you're better off if you can match it and still ensure that the rest of your antenna is efficient, which I've gotten into also. It's some pretty sophisticated stuff. That's why I like it so much. I guess it's kind of esoteric and kind of weird and complicated. You also have what they call inherent line loss, which the manufacturer will tell you. You buy a piece of line, you look it up in their manufacturer's specs, and it's going to tell you what the perfectly matched line loss is. If you want to figure out what the SWR loss is based on a given SWR and a given initial line loss, get the ARRL antenna book. I presume they still publish that. It is a wonderful publication, and if it's as good as the old ones were today now, if they haven't degraded the quality of this, as our nation seems to have degraded the quality of almost everything else in recent years, I would say get this book. Well, you know, you can probably find this stuff on the internet too. But I recommend you buy ARRL's publications. They're the best in the business. Stan Gibilisco, W1GV, Whiskey 1 Golf Victor, signing off and saying 73. Until next time, so long.